Welcome to the second reading in the Sowell Collection's Spring 2024 virtual reading series. I'm Kristen Lloyd, Director of the Sowell Family Collection and Literature Community in the Natural World, and your host for tonight. This semester's series highlights the collection's collaboration with Texas Tech Press. The Sowell Emerging Writers Prize and the Sowell Collection Book Series promote the work of Sowell and Sowell-adjacent authors whose writing explores, among other themes, the intersection of human and non-human communities, scientific and spiritual values, and the role of environment, landscape, and place in literature. Tonight, we are joined by Kate Neville, whose book, Going to Seed, Essays on Idleness, Nature, and Sustainable Work, is the winner of the 2023 Sowell Emerging Writers Prize. Yay, Kate! Now in its second year, the Emerging Writers Prize is a collaboration between the collection, TTUP, and terrain.org. The prize would not be possible without the hard work of my partners, Dr. Diane Warner, former librarian for the Sowell Collection, Kurt Caswell, TTU Honors Professor, Travis Snyder, Editor-in-Chief of TTU Press, and the fabulous terrain.org editorial staff, Simmons Button, Elizabeth Dodd, Pam Houston, and Derek Sheffield. And a special second shout out to Elizabeth Dodd, our moderator tonight. Last month, we announced the winner of the 2024 prize, Birds at Night by Ivy Liebenberg. The poems in Birds at Night explore themes of loss, trauma, PTSD, recovery, indigeneity, and family. They amplify the sensations and silences of interior moments of crisis and catharsis, a haunting meditation on what keeps us up at night. Drawing on the resilience of the natural world, Birds at Night is defined by migration and adaptation, both in content and poetics. So it will be published next spring, so keep an eye out for Birds at Night and for Ivy. We have one more reading this semester. Robert Michael Pyle will read on May 9th at 6 p.m. Central, and I'm going to drop a link to register for that in the chat. And finally, during tonight's reading, if you keep your microphones muted, and please turn your cameras on if you feel comfortable doing so. Cameras on helps us feel like we're creating a community. We open for audience questions. You can type them into the chat box for Elizabeth to read, or if you'd like to unmute and ask away, that'll work too. So now I'm going to turn things over to Elizabeth and Kate.
Thank you, Kristen. It is such a delight to be here this evening and to have the honor of introducing Kate Neville to you this evening. I am Elizabeth Dodd. I'm the nonfiction editor at terrain.org, and I'm coming to you from Kansas State University in the Flint Hills region of eastern Kansas. It's indigenous land that was forcefully ceded in a series of treaties with tribal nations, including the Kaw, the Osage, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Sac and Fox, and the Iowa. I've been looking forward to this for days now. Kate Neville is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and School of the Environment at the University of Toronto in Canada. Her academic background includes degrees in biology, environmental science, and political science. Her declared research interests are global and environmental politics, international political economy, and what she calls contentious politics. Her first book, Fueling Resistance, is an academic examination of controversies over biofuels in Kenya and fracking in the Canadian Yukon. She's published many articles, and their titles reveal the breadth of her thinking about the more than human world and our ethical entanglements with it, or with them. Here's a tiny sample of some of her titles. Nestling sex ratios of golden-winged warblers in an introgressed population. Mind bombs of right and wrong. Cycles of contention in the activist campaign to stop Canada's seal hunt. And shadows of divestment, the complications of diverting fossil fuel finance. This is an impressive and important bunch of work, but I want to claim tonight that all of her scholarship on environment and social or economic justice has really been preparing her to write the book that we are celebrating and honoring tonight. Going to Seed, Essays on Idleness, Nature, and Sustainable Work is a wise and playful exploration of how to step outside conventional ideas of productivity and economy, how to inhabit a life with time and intention for the much more than human world. Probably many of you with us this evening have already thought about how ecology and economy both come from the word hearth of oikos, the household, where someone is nearly always busy cooking or cleaning or doing homework, but maybe sometimes pausing to just look, really look out the window. And that's exactly the context for Kate's book. It's written in a remote, off-the-grid cabin, guided by observations of the other lives inhabiting the larger watershed. Grasshopper, bear, beaver, fir tree, willow, salmon, owl, and even the mice that start building a nest of dog hair and insulation foam in the cabin lean-to, which Kate has playfully named the watershed as well. This is a generous-spirited, witty, and unpredictable challenge to so many of the modes of thought that bundle inflexibly together in support of capitalism. You're in for a treat tonight, and when you have the chance to read the whole book, it will be another treat again. Please join me this evening in making very welcome the first winner of the Sowell Emerging Writers Prize, Kate Neville.
Oh my goodness, Elizabeth, thank you for that absolutely beautiful and kind and generous introduction. It really is such an honor to get to be here and be welcomed into this incredible community from a distance. And I will speak to that distance and that place in a minute. I really want to thank the Sowell Collection. Kristen, thank you for that kind of quick walkthrough of some of the incredible activities that the Sowell Collection is convening and nurturing the writing that is being held and really grown in that space. Others who are here, Kurt, Elizabeth, Diane Warner, who I was just speaking about at the beginning of our time together before many of you joined, was really the kind of starting point for my knowledge of the Sowell Collection through my partner, Kate Harris, who is here, who joined an early Sowell conference. Simmons Bunton at terrain.org, such generous readers and supporters of work, promoters of literary endeavor. A huge number of people, Travis Snyder, my editor at Texas Tech University Press, who is not here tonight, but really has been a constant champion through this project. The University of Regina Press as well, that's picked it up for the Canadian audience. And just all of the visionaries in this community who have sort of created space for thinking differently about writing and the relationship with the natural world, taking a long history of this work and finding ways to continually connect to the past and then make it new into the future, bringing in new voices and new community members so generously and expansively. So I'm so thrilled to be able to be here. And in fact, some of the pieces of my maybe unusual path will become a little bit clearer in some of the essays, parts that I'll share tonight and parts that you might read. And I will say you can read a sneak preview. It doesn't come out until the middle of May, but a sneak preview, the introductory essay, has just been published on terrain.org, thanks to Simmons and team. And so if you want to have a full essay, you're welcome to find it there. So spring is erupting here, right, in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, where I'm joining you from. And I've been thinking a lot about movements and peregrinations as I think about a shift back to that northern cabin that Elizabeth mentioned, kind of starts off the book, that includes that watershed. But so I think a lot about place and where am I and where am I from? Where am I living? Whose lands am I on, both human and other than human, and the kind of wide weave of worlds that comes together that way. And so here in Toronto, I'm on the shores of Lake Ontario. These are the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and they're also on Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant lands. which is a covenant between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And that really sort of is it's sort of an English awkward translation of a really expansive concept of resources, how we really think about the lives and livelihoods and human and other than humans that share these spaces. I'll be heading hopefully in early summer back up to northern British Columbia at the Yukon border on the unceded lands of the Taku River Tlingit First Nation. And that's where a lot of this book was written and really draws deeply from. So a place I'm really lucky to get to spend time that's incredibly protected by the Taku River Tlingit First Nation historically and contemporarily, really then and now and into the future. Incredible vision in that community, in that nation. And so as I think about these places, these are the places that I'm spending time now. But one of the essays in the book kind of takes us back to places where I grew up, not where my ancestors are from, roots are very far afield, but a place that I spent my childhood. So one summer in university, I landed a job with the Provincial Ministry of Natural Resources, tasked with circumnavigating the remnant woodlots of southwestern Ontario to find nesting birds, putting out transects to count salamanders, enumerating shrubs and ground cover in small vegetation plots. I was by far the least experienced of the team, having made my way through my teenage years with distinctly non-avian obsessions, joining letter writing campaigns with Amnesty International and paddling kayaks, rather than noticing eye rings and undertail coverts and committing to memory the mnemonics of birdsong. But I had awakened to the thrill of ecology during a first-year lecture course and was sure my future would be in field biology. My unbridled enthusiasm must have compensated for my missing knowledge during what could only be described as a complete disaster of an interview. And I found myself that summer discovering that a landscape I had known mainly as fields of corn and canola and tobacco, with rapidly encroaching suburban sprawl, was also home to tulip trees and hooded warblers, wood thrush and jewelweed. How had I missed this before? I was determined to make up for lost time. Collecting individuals into groups is not always an erasure of the specific and the distinct, I soon learned. I traversed woodlots with Roger Torrey Peterson and Audubon field guides tucked in my pockets, different versions of the same abundance of species that surrounded me, as indistinct calls and warbles and trills began to resolve themselves into identifiable species. I fell asleep most nights that summer to tapes of birdsong, a calm voice intoning the name, a brief melody or buzz or chip, the name repeated, trying desperately to learn these new languages, to know a landscape by its voices. I had to reorient my listening, in part to compensate for my still beginner skills with binoculars, where I'd finally get the lenses into focus just as the bird flew away, nothing but a blur of motion in the dappled light of the canopy. What I wanted that summer more than anything was to blend myself with the forest, to be indistinct from the sugar maples and white oak. I tried not to make the ovenbird nervous in her journey to her woven domed nest in the understory, though I never did achieve this. Mine was a singular purpose, to become intimate with the land I grew up in. I had returned to Ontario from some high school years out west, a region I loved and still love fiercely, and one that would call me back in my adult years. But I needed that summer to learn the terrain of my childhood in a new way, to become less estranged from it, and so less resigned to its destruction by strip malls and highways and monocultures. The river I grew up near was so beaten by industrial pollution that we were warned at the City Rowing Club not to trail our hands in the water over the side of the boat, and especially not to flip at risk of skin rashes. What I only learned later was that the river's Anishinaabemowin name, Deshkan-Ziibi, translates to Antler River, gesturing to the branch structure that forks near what is now the city center. In these lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lunapiwak, Wendat, and Attawandaron, the river sustained many nations before the Carolinian forests were replaced by subdivisions, before blight wiped out the sweet chestnut. The river's colonial English name, the Thames, has no such connections, recalling instead the Cotswolds' foggy cobbled streets, the distant North Sea. What if I had always known the river's earlier name? If I had grown up recognizing velvety, ungulate bones reflected in those waters, rather than a second-rate replica of a famous waterway from another continent, would I have seen it as distinct, seen it for itself? There, with the black willows and cottonwoods, might have been a sycamore tree that had been alive since before the colonial renaming of the river, a line connecting the past to the future, and the possibilities still held in those flowing waters. And so I wanted to start with that to sort of place where I am now into this context of learning where it is I've come from and what it is that we gain and lose through language and learning names that have been written over multiple times. And it's a passage that comes from an essay about place, about what names both enable but also obscure, and how we might recognize others and their distinctiveness, but at the same time maybe hold back from certainty as part of the process of making space for others. So in lots of ways, the essays in this collection are about these kind of blurry lines and contradictions, these kind of tensions and uncertainties. And so I want to dip into a few sections with you tonight, introducing some of the stories and ideas and some of these contradictions that I explore along the way. So this is a book in lots of ways about idleness, and it's hard not to think about productivity, about kind of doing and making and racing through things in the midst of a big urban center here in Toronto, right at the end of a school term, as we are at the University of Toronto, in the midst of exams and grading and all of the things that come with academic rhythms of life. And so thinking a little bit about kind of this motion and this kind of constant movement, and also these cycles of rest and renewal that can come with that. I'll read from an essay on bears and on rest. In the spring, grizzlies, another name for North American brown bears, their coloring ranging from cream to nearly black, emerge from their dens, leaner by far than when they entered them in the late fall. In parts of Alaska, female grizzlies spend more than 7 months in dens, leaving their winter lodgings with only a third of the body fat they started with. Their counterparts in southeastern British Columbia and in Montana and Wyoming's Yellowstone National Park lose less of their heft over the winter, but also spend a month and a half less in dens. This is a hungry time, a long fast, with the initiation and duration of denning dictated by food availability, weather, altitude. These bears survive the lean winter months by slowing down radically, dropping their body temperatures by a few degrees, their heart rates by as much as 80%, their metabolic functions to just over a quarter of their non-hibernation rates. At the lower reaches of Arctic tundra, boreal forests encircle the globe. These are the landscapes of grizzly bears. Bears possess what writer Ellen Malloy describes as metabolic extremes, though when she wrote this, she was describing creatures of the US Southwest, specifically spadefoot toads. The dormant slumber and brief frenetic activity, in Malloy's words, of the burrowing desert amphibians matches the desert's own rhythms. And such wild fluctuations are echoed in unexpected places, in the snowdrifts with the bears, underground with the toads, in the air with the birds. Take the hummingbird, for instance, if you can hold it still long enough. In a tender essay on vulnerability, the writer Brian Doyle observes that a hummingbird heart beats 10 times each second in spite of its tiny size. This is no exaggeration. Some species have heart rates of twice that speed, hitting 1,200 beats per minute when in flight. Iridescent and mostly in motion, we tend to think of them hovering and diving between sips of nectar. But Doyle recounts that in the face of cold nights or near starvation, these birds enter into a state of torpor, with, in his words, their hearts sludging nearly to a halt, barely beating. Torpor is a sort of sped up version of hibernation with metabolic drops that last for a single circadian cycle. Some hummingbird species in Peru can drop their body temperatures by as much as 30 degrees Celsius overnight, a survival mechanism for the extreme environment of the high Andean mountains. The black metaltail hummingbird, for instance, is found at elevations that range from 2,700 to 4,300 meters, and lower their heart rates to as low as 40 beats per minute in a nocturnal, near-death experience that makes it possible for life to go on. At a friend's birthday party a few years back, I found myself in the midst of a discussion about books with a few tech entrepreneurs I had just met. For someone who has fallen into a scholarly path, literature wasn't an unusual topic among my friends and acquaintances. But at this party, the conversation took an unexpected turn. It wasn't the choice of text that took me aback, but the medium and delivery of their intake of words. This curious and creative group was so hungry for information and so pressed for time that they listened to their chosen text as audiobooks at twice the usual pace. They listened to these sped up versions while they commuted to offices or ran circuits for training or vacuumed their apartments, each moment fully spent. They did this too, I learned, when watching videos and lectures, taking in a barrage of information. Such an approach was particularly striking to me, as I had recently listened to a podcast at a regular speed and still found myself stopping and backing it up regularly, repeating some sections 3 or 4 times. I kept this experience to myself at that gathering, having learned from Mark Sluka in his essay Quitting the Paint Factory that at a dinner party, a revelation about his preference for 8 or 9 hours of sleep was taken by that crowd as an affront. No doubt I would have had some sidelong glances had I revealed my relaxed, even sluggish listening. I wasn't thinking about hummingbirds at the time, but later, when I remembered that party, I saw a room filled with wings, zipping backwards and forwards, a dynamic hovering of constant motion. And so as you might guess from sort of that piece that recounts, I'm drawn to these questions of idleness, of slowness, and the contradictions that are kind of embedded in how quickly we need to respond to the pressures of the world, and particularly these kind of big environmental challenges with urgency, with amped up and amplified kind of scales of responses, and yet how paradoxically some of that kind of quick response requires a slowing down, requires us to step back, to pause. And when I say us, that's part of what this book kind of looks at, is who is the us at which moments, who need to kind of move forward or slow down, who need to be given space to be able to amp up their own activities and work and are kind of held down by the speed of others. And as sort of you'll have seen, it draws out of this background in biology that I was maybe ill-equipped at the outset of that kind of early training in ornithology and knowing birds to be part of. It led to one of those papers that Elizabeth read you the name of, that really was the result of a lot of very patient teachers, professors, researchers who kind of drew me into looking more closely and taking the time to kind of get to know this world around me. And I think a lot of that kind of early training and thinking about watching those birds is what drew me to writing in this kind of particular way. But the themes of energy, the themes of work, the themes of idleness, in lots of kind of the ideas that I'm wrestling with in the book come out of that scholarly work on energy and that contested politics that Elizabeth mentioned, this sort of how we think about what we need for an energy transition, how are we making energy, where are we getting it from, who's in charge of that, where is it being produced, and what in particular are we using it for? And so this kind of piece from the introduction maybe will give you a bit of a sense of both the kind of context of work and also what I sort of drew on to think about idleness. The widespread uptake of the science of thermodynamics, with its history in the Scottish Presbyterian world of Glasgow in the 1700s, drove a particular understanding of energy that took on social as well as pragmatic industrial significance, the scholar Karanuk Daggett explains. There's a sort of clarity and a vision that equates fuel with energy and work with productivity, employment, and morality. Work is understood as the central tool to survive, to prevail, and to succeed in a world that tends to entropy and dissolution. With such a view, opting out of these equations is to reject progress itself, embracing a form of shiftlessness and even depravity. But what to make then of this counsel from the writer Mark Sluka against filling our time with work? He writes, idleness is not just a psychological necessity, requisite to the construction of a complete human being, it constitutes as well a kind of political space, a space as necessary to the workings of an actual democracy as, say, a free press. Sluka expands on this claim in a provocative essay, calling idleness unconstrained and anarchic. He suggests that idle time provides people with the chance to reflect on their values, beliefs, commitments to justice, and strategies for enacting change. Far from an embrace of sin or a dodge of responsibility, idleness is recast as a political project, and an unsettling one for those in power. All manner of things can grow out of that fallow soil, Sluka writes, with indeterminacy at the core of his point. That fallow soil of our imagination, that undirected energy of our independent minds, at rest yet restless, unoccupied yet invigorated. Citizenship, for Sluka, especially a democratic version, requires time and unclaimed intellectual space in which each person can consider what they see as necessary for a flourishing society. Being constantly occupied, whether in waged labor or in commercialized forms of leisure, leaves no space to form our own values and views and ethical judgments, and so leaves us ill-equipped to contribute to a collective social and political life. Instead, we are too harried to mount any challenge to inequity, servility, creeping authoritarianism, or even its fully fledged version. Idleness, then, might be a crucial emancipatory project. And so this is the starting point of sort of exploring what is it that idleness might bring us when so much of my research is focused on work and energy. What about that pause? What about something else? And so I ground these explorations of these kind of big, heady themes that have been so beautifully explored by scholars of work and of leisure and of kind of these systems of production, really in what happens when we pay attention to the work of others. So what happens when there's certain forms of human work that pause, and then we can make space for thinking about the work of others. So really, I think here of non-human work. And one example is in an essay on beavers and resistance, sort of turning our attention to what it is that human work also undoes in the world around us. So this is sort of starting midway through a section. Often the tireless efforts of beavers undo our own work, plugging culverts, slowing river flow with sediment, challenging our attempts to drain and manage our farms and dams and roads. Beavers alternately are described as pests, detrimental species, and even predatory animals by those trying to wrestle lands and waters into agricultural production and roadways. In national forests in the United States, their dam construction has flooded enough adjacent cropland to provoke deep resentment. One senator, in a subcommittee hearing with the Forest Service, noted, apparently ruefully, that of course private landowners cannot legally go onto the public lands and tear down a beaver dam or blow up a beaver dam. He stopped shy of asking for these laws to change, but given the tenor of the exchange, I suspect he wished they would. Beavers are certainly resistors of human labor. They work against us, but then let's flip the view. We work against them. We straighten winding rivers with our canals, speed up waters with our channelizing efforts, erode banks with that faster water flow, then pile up rock and rubble, known as riprap, to try to slow that erosion. We might say that we are each running to stand still, as with Alice and the Red Queen in Lewis Carroll's famed Through the Looking Glass story. Well, in our country, says young Alice to the redoubtable Red Queen, you generally get somewhere else if you've ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. The Red Queen scoffs, a slow sort of country. Here, the Queen tells her, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. Carroll's tale has sparked generations of biologists to use the story as a metaphor for evolutionary processes. Some describe these as an escalating arms race, and others as non-progressive evolution, wherein the adaptations of predators and prey, or of the sexes, or of parasites and hosts, continually ratchet up in response to those of the other, leaving both, in relation to each other, roughly where they started. Progress stymied, energy wasted. Is this just a story of a deadlocked impasse with the same outcomes as if we and the beavers stayed still, without all the building and tearing down of dams. We call it idling when a car engine runs out of gear, turning and turning. We establish ordinances against this, restrictions and bylaws, as much, it sometimes seems, to guard against the absence of productivity as to reduce emissions or local noise. Energy expended must not be in vain, from the Latin vanus, empty, without substance, producing no result. We could speed up, shift into a higher gear. As the Queen proffers, if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. But speeding up is what we've already done. We trap beavers, dislocate them, destroy lodges, dismantle dams. This seems the wrong lesson to take from Alice. It is unfair to compare the work practices of the beavers to our own rapacious ones, or to suggest some kind of equitable arms race. They may threaten our productivity, our domestic and industrial efforts, but the labor of the beavers is not for them alone. They are the creators of space for others, the enablers of others' work. Their dams and lodges slow currents, fill ponds, create pools and channels. Their painstaking work offers up new abodes and sustenance beyond themselves, lives and livelihoods for other species. To the Queen, Alice counters, I'm quite content to stay here. Now, a static here is never quite a place to stay, and the industrious beavers know this. For the sake of overwintering fish, breeding insects, and feeding moose, we might hope the beavers continue their measured forestry practices and their rearrangements of river currents. To enable this, though, we humans might do well to follow Alice's lead and stay a little more still. And so that kind of stillness, the stillness for some, particularly those of us who are caught up in these urban and industrial systems of production, this kind of constant movement, and maybe that is particularly poignant for those of you who are in noisy spaces, urban spaces, where it seems like there's never quite a pause in that activity of machinery and the kind of built environment. I want to kind of end with one more passage that really is about kind of the role of not just what slowing down is needed for, but also what it can offer up to us. And part of the goal of these essays is not just to sort of make a call to slow down or stop or idle a little bit more, but to really think about what these different modes of speed and of production and of rest and of these kind of moments of pause might bring to us. And I think maybe being here in the Sowell collection's kind of space and community in particular, I think so often of the joyfulness that is brought out in literature around the kind of relationship between humans and the non-human world. What I found in that time in those Carolinian woodlots when I was a university student, just learning the birds, and what I even kind of find sometimes in the urban center of Toronto when there's an owl hooting in High Park, sort of surprisingly, these kind of moments of the sounds of others that bring such joy. How do we create space for those voices and for paying attention to them? We flee to the woods, to the mountains, to the poles, to escape that ever constant noise. Polar traveler Erling Kage writes of an expedition in Antarctica. At home, there's always a car passing, a telephone ringing, pinging, or buzzing, someone talking, whispering, yelling. There are so many noises that we barely hear them all. Here, it was different. Nature spoke to me in the guise of silence. It was not just his surrounds that needed silencing, but himself, his inner thrum. He continues, the quieter I became, the more I heard. And with vision, too, what initially seemed both blank and silent resolved itself with the sound of the wind into a rich and textured land. I began to notice that nothing was completely flat after all, he says. The ice and snow formed small and large abstract shapes. The uniform whiteness was transformed into countless shades of white. It isn't so much that there isn't sound outside our own human activity, but more that respite from noise of our own making is needed for that of others to be heard. And this is true not only for the whistling winds in Antarctic deserts, but for the quiet murmur of other beings in places thronging with human sound. The journalist Ed Yong examines the acoustic lives of plants, for instance, pointing to recent studies that suggest plants both make and hear noises, using sound to communicate with insect pollinators. While much of the research remains in early stages, it makes intuitive sense to those scientists, reports Yong, that plants might send and respond to airborne vibrations, just as they use chemical signals for defense. As Yong observes, it's not that the fields of flowers are truly silent, we just don't usually pay attention. The writer Barry Lopez, too, writes of the sounds of others that we only barely understand and have only recently begun to perceive. In his expansive book, Arctic Dreams, he writes of the spiral-tusked narwhal, its limited vision, its nearly imperceptible, to human hearing at least, range of sounds, its ongoing impenetrability to scientific understanding. With so little we truly know about these deep water cetaceans, Lopez suggests an attitude of humility is needed, the taking of a respectful attitude, he enjoins, toward a mystery we can do no better than name narwhal. And so I think it might be fitting to end kind of the reading of this with Barry Lopez here at the Sowell Collection, such a generous figure in his writing and in his being to so many writers and readers. The path that he set for so many into forms of writing that pay attention, and his words that brought all of us along, that really attend to that mystery. And it's such a gift to be able to join in these conversations on the page and then here in person, or at least in virtual person, and share in that kind of joyfulness that comes through the wild and unruly world that we get to be in. So thank you so much for joining tonight.
Kate, thank you so very much. It was wonderful to hear you read those excerpts, hear them in your voice, and the voices that you're in conversation with, including, of course, Barry's voice as well. We're going to open this up to Q&A. And so, gentle people, wherever you are, if you would like to put something in the chat, or if you would like to put up your hand or unmute, we'll be glad to have you pose questions for our author tonight. But I'm going to start, if I may, while people are getting their thoughts together. So I have a question for you, Kate. Early on in the book, it might even be in the introduction, you note that the work of various other, and you call them entities, are mostly invisible to us, or I think you call them illegible to us. And those different entities, as you describe them, range from fungi all the way to the elements themselves, and the way those are invisible to us. And through the whole book, you point to various scholars' definitions of work. I mean, we're meditating on work as well as idleness all the way through. Have you, by the end of this project, come up with your own definition of work that either is or is not a political economist's definition of work?
Oh, Elizabeth, that's such a great question. I would say that at the end of all of this, and maybe kind of fittingly for this process, I remain more muddled than ever about how we put kind of boundaries on these terms and kind of concepts. And I was having a conversation with a colleague who is, he's in the humanities and works in kind of wide-ranging energy cultures research, a field of study. And we were talking in part about how hard it is to describe things without using the word work. You know, what is it that we do when we're sort of putting our attention into something? And we were talking about creative practices and about kind of the scholarly endeavor, you know, what happens when we're lost in thought and getting to play with ideas, or when we're engaging with the writings of a student that we get to be so lucky to work with here. You know, I can't even kind of say these sentences without using the word work, but it means so many slippery different things. And I think I didn't come to a clear definition as much as sort of this space between, you know, how what it is that when we use that word, we want to convey. So what is it we're trying to signal to others? And what are we kind of obscuring when we use that term? So sort of both what it does for us and what it allows us to kind of elide in our maybe our responsibilities, sort of something to hide behind, that this is a serious form of work, whereas these other things are sort of unserious leisure activities, or that we want to kind of reinforce a particular form of activity in the world that has value in a monetary way versus things that we don't want to call that because we don't want to associate them with these forms of exchange and kind of compensation. And so, yeah, I think it's such a space that I don't think is in any way kind of answered through the essays that I've written.
Well, thank you. And the chapter or the essay dealing with the grasshopper is so emblematic of that messiness. I commend it to people. We've got another question, at least from one person. I see a hand up. Bailey Jet Mills, would you please unmute and go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, I just want to say I really enjoyed listening to you read. I had the pleasure of reading some of your work early on since I'm working for the press right now and I was learning about copy editing. So that was a pleasure to get to meet you in person. And I wanted to ask you, what made you decide to publish your book with a small university press as opposed to a larger publishing house?
Oh, well, so first, Bailey, thank you and your whole team for engaging so carefully and thoughtfully with this work. I mean, it's a book that has my name on it, but it really is the product of so many both conversations and then really careful editing, conversations with Elizabeth on the page over distance, and kind of a long-standing set of kind of careful attention. But I would say that maybe I had the luck of landing with Texas Tech University Press because of the Sowell collection, because of the Sowell Emerging Writers Prize, because of the collaboration between terrain.org and the Sowell collection and Texas Tech University Press to kind of put this together. I submitted this book for consideration by the prize when it was a manuscript only, when it was in draft form entirely. And they sort of saw that maybe seed of promise in it and help nurture it into being. And that was, with Travis at Texas Tech University Press. And I would say that I would recommend a small university press like maybe Texas Tech University Press. If it's representative, I would, recommend that sort of press to anyone. But I suspect there's something very distinct even among the world of small university presses with Texas Tech University Press. It's such a special place that has this real commitment to place and to groundedness in these kind of sort of cultural, natural spaces, the kind of distinctiveness of particular places. And that at least was really supportive of the work that I've been trying to do.
Thank you for that question, Bailey. Who else? I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any that have come through the chat. If there aren't others from the audience yet, I'm going to jump in with another of mine. Kate, you read to us a little bit of the bear chapter, which I love. And I learned in that chapter, you write about polar bears undergoing not only a much longer hibernation, but what you called a walking hibernation, that there are times that they are actually not denning, and that's part of the time of hunger that they're engaged with. And it seemed to me like a real complication of the dichotomy, the conceptual dichotomy between activity and idleness that you've been examining throughout the book. And it just created an incredible image for me of bears that we ought to be, or that we do conceive of as denning and having this cozy time of hibernation, and instead it being one of real extremity. I just wanted to kind of call out that image and ask if you would help us unpack it a little bit further, with with some of our expectations of what we think we know about hibernation and what we really don't know and maybe should.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because this maybe is a good way also of me sharing that each of the essays, as Elizabeth has kind of shared, grounds itself in a particular plant or animal, kind of non-human creature of some kind, fir trees and bears and salmon, and in a concept. So resistance or slowness or detours, various kinds of conceptual dimensions. But something that was really important to me, and that this kind of question of the bear really brings out, is that animals and plants, the kind of non-human world, were not just vehicles through which to tell you about these concepts. So they weren't just kind of devices to be able to share something intellectual and idea-based or abstract. It really was in the writing of these and learning about some of these processes of kind of the animal world, the plant world, that I came to think about the concepts in particular ways, and rest is one of them. And so I kind of started some of the process of writing, thinking certain things about hibernation, that it's, you know, we think about it as a cycle of rest followed by activity, followed by rest. And sort of what I knew most about hibernation was that it wasn't as consistent as we thought. So there were periods of this kind of dropped metabolism, and then certain species of bears in certain times of their hibernation will wake up at certain points. And I still thought it was this divide between kind of rest and activity. And what I learned in reading about hibernation and about bears is that there's a huge amount of variation in what happens during that denning period, during that hibernation period. So female bears will give birth and will nurse their young while they're in their dens. So that's sort of part of why we see these massive drops in body fat between the kind of fall and then when they come out in the spring. And so kind of this point at which you're thinking about this incredibly active time of reproduction and of nursing, interlaced with this kind of time of rest and retreat, that these two things are held at the same time in that same space by these same creatures. And the polar bear example, I was so struck when I read this. So I was reading all kinds of papers by scientists. You know, I'm not a bear biologist. I have not studied these. So I'm just reading these papers, and I learned, and this is what you're sort of sharing, Elizabeth, that, and this is from the text I wrote about it. So sort of my understanding: in the summer and fall, females engage in a walking hibernation, fasting when the absence of sea ice prevents them from hunting marine mammals. And the winter, with cubs, they spend 2/3 of the year in a den without food. So we have them sort of giving birth and having this kind of period of time with their cubs in the winter, but even in the summer and fall, they might not be able to eat that much. There's sort of these periods of time without those marine mammals at hand. So even though they're out and about in the world, they're still not getting that sustenance. And I was so sort of struck by the similarities between the two. We think of these periods as so different, and yet there's this kind of same phenomenon of sort of losing themselves in this world around them and being both the source of food and nurturing, and also kind of seeking it out, but not always being fulfilled. And so I really think that helped me wrestle more, or maybe at least illuminate, if not come to any answers, about the relationship that we have between rest and activity, between rest and productivity. And in part because so often we want to think of rest, and we talk about rest as preparing us for action. That sort of what rest is important for is so that we can then be productive in the world, and sort of pushing back on that division and on the dichotomy between the two, the ways they can operate at the same time, but also the kind of independence they have, that they're not always one for the other one. There's sort of a relationship, but it's not always so direct or one-sided.
That's fantastic. Thank you for teaching me this. We've got some comments coming through in the chat. I don't know if you can see them, Kate. Thanks so much for introducing Francisca to such an original perspective and allowing us to ponder different ways of living our lives. Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing your work, Kate. And here's a question that's come in from Janalee Chernesky, who would like to invite you to apply this thinking about activity, idleness, and rest to the concept of home, which is where I wanted to start too, with oikos, and both economy and ecology. So back to the concept of home. How would you, Kate, say the process of this book has shifted or enhanced the way you conceive of home? Or, if easier, your own activity of making home in the world?
Oh,
Terrific
thank you.
question.
It is, and I will say one of the delights of this kind of virtual world is bringing together colleagues and friends from across places. Jana Lee actually is acknowledged in the book, in my acknowledgments, as one of those with whom I've had these kind of rich conversations. Her own work that includes questions of labor and time and kind of the political philosophy elements of sort of how we think about work and the relationships with society are just so generative. And she asked kind of some probing questions early on in the writing that were like this question, as you can tell, are sort of an invitation to thinking further. And I would say, there's so much to say about place and about sort of where we are in the world. So maybe one piece that I'll start with is that the making of home in northern BC, so not having been from there, but sort of coming as an adult to this cabin, to Atlin, which is at the border of BC and the Yukon on Taku River Tlingit territory. That sort of idea of how do I learn about a place? How do I connect myself to that place? What do I pay attention to in these initially unfamiliar lands that I'm sort of learning slowly and again, was enhanced by the process of writing this book, was sort of informed by it, sort of generated some of these questions and these observations and these moments of encounter. And in that, and then in writing about it, I've sort of gone back into those places and some of those relationships with place, maybe in a new way, thinking about taking more time in those particular places to really think about the depths of what is happening. My own relationship of sort of living in a cabin with my partner, Kate, who's also here on this call. Sort of how is it that we make sense of our own kind of disruptions to the place around us, in our need for sort of speeding up and moving through in particular ways. And for me, it's really maybe most fraught in the context of being an academic in an off-grid place, far from the place that I am working. So how do I think about kind of making home in a place, but also being tied elsewhere so extensively and so continually through these, incredible virtual media that allow us all to be here together today, but also come with these consequences and these costs to our ability to be very grounded and connected to where we are, and that require all kinds of resources that come in from elsewhere. And so I think it sort of makes me think about those contradictions of making home and being in a home and a place in multiple directions, and sort of how do I step back? How do I slow down my own kind of movement in the world, particularly to make space for those others that are so abundant and enriching around me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lee Scabland has put a couple of links to interesting facts about beavers, some hopeful nods toward beavers. So people, you can follow through and do some further beaver reading. And Simmons, there's a terrific piece by who is that piece by? In Dear America, we have a wonderful essay on beavers in Dear America as well. I don't think we published that on terrain.org.
Yeah, and I don't have the book with me to pull it up. I can't think of it off the top of my head either. There's a great piece on ferrets too, but
This is true too. Yes. Well, anybody else? Other questions? We probably have time for one more. And if nobody else is, I'm going to ask one more question. Kate, are there any other species that you think are instructive in some way that you considered pursuing for the book and for one reason or another didn't?
Oh, every time I turn around, I feel like there is another kind of example of how we can think about the complexity of relationships of work and mutualism and reciprocity in the world around us, and kind of these moments of pause and what pops up when we're not looking. And some of them make little appearances in various essays. So mushrooms are a really good example. And they sort of, as they are wont to do, they sort of pop up in different places in the text, in part because, you never quite expect what is happening under the earth to suddenly become visible, and their kind of relationships to tree roots and the communication that happens. Speaking of kind of communication of plants, that it's sort of this mix. In lots of ways, I tried, although I didn't do this consistently, I tried to ground each of the essays in a species that was recognizable in at least kind of North American and Western literary traditions, with certain, and maybe cultural experiences with certain kinds of activities. So the grasshopper essay that Elizabeth mentions wasn't just grasshoppers. That was maybe the most kind of literary structural animal that I used kind of instructively, metaphorically, rather than it itself. The ants that show up are much more the ants that are of the cabin, but the kind of idea of the ant and the grasshopper fable that tells us about the morality of work and saving for the future against the kind of grasshopper that fiddles away its future in the summer, not gathering any grain, that those sorts of things. I tried to really think about what had resonance in these kind of cultural stories in particular ways. But I think that in lots of ways I could have picked almost anything and started lots of these questions. So I think there's maybe more to think through.
No, fair point. Fair point. You could have picked almost anything.
Sounds to me like you should write a sequel.
It does.
Yeah. Well, Kate, Elizabeth, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Really, the book comes out in mid-May. There's a link in the chat. I'll send you an email. Please buy a copy, read a copy, tell all your friends. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you all for
Thank you,
coming.
Kate.
Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, such a gift to get to be here.